resistance and resilience, and she's going to chat about that tonight. Some of her materials are already available on the website. I will drop a link into the chat. Si vous souhaitez en savoir plus, je vais aussi partager le lien à la page d'accueil du projet. Charlene va présenter en anglais ce soir, mais moi, je suis heureuse de vous répondre en français pendant la période de questions où vous pouvez envoyer des courriels en français aussi. Je vais mettre mon adresse dans le chat. Merci beaucoup et je vais passer à Charlene maintenant. Charlene, thank you so much for being here. We're looking forward to your presentation.
Awesome. Thank you, Amanda. All right, good evening, everyone, and thanks for taking time out of your summer to join us tonight. It is still summer. I'm fighting off a bit of a cold, so I might need to clear my throat here and there. But just a bit about me. Right now I'm living in London, Ontario, and I've had various experiences in Indigenous education. So I'll just say Wache, Charlene Camillo, Indigenous Cassin, Dipascow Bisa Musqueyo, Indigenous Cassin, Moose Cree First Nation, Nudichin. So my mom is from Moose Factory, Ontario, and my father is Italian. I grew up in Northern Ontario, so I'm a graduate of Espanola High School. And 20 years ago, this fall, I moved down to London to attend Western. And I've been teaching in the Thames Valley District School Board going into my 14th year. 6 of those years, I was a learning coordinator within Indigenous education, so supported the entire school board with including more Indigenous content, building relationships with Indigenous students and families, and much more. So that's basically what has guided some of this work we're going to go through tonight. And for 7 years, I've been a teacher at Saunders Secondary School. This year will be the first time my full schedule will be Indigenous studies, which is really exciting. A lot of growth and interest, many Indigenous and non-Indigenous students in the classes. And overall, I've had a lot of experience in this area in London and been fortunate to work alongside many students and families from the 3 First Nations that are nearby. So Oneida Nation of the Thames, Chippewas, the Thames First Nation, and Munsee Delaware Nation. So the series that Amanda referenced is going to include online the recording of this webinar, but not including the question and answer period. 2 blogs that are going to be the focus of tonight's session, and then also 15 lesson plans along the themes of Indigenous resistance and resilience, and ways to include Indigenous leaders and uplifting stories that are also about affirming rights, supporting Indigenous identities, and overall just responding to the call that a lot of students have of wanting to learn more about Indigenous peoples. So the input and guidance that I'm providing tonight is basically different things that I've learned from students and families, but also if you are coming from a school in Ontario in the provincial system, our Ministry of Education ensures that every school board has to have an Indigenous education lead. So the guidance that I provide tonight, make sure you're always connecting with your Indigenous education lead. They also might have curriculum support specialists or a local Indigenous education advisory group that should be guiding the work that they do. So there's not one way of doing this work, but one thing that's important is always making sure that Indigenous students and families are guiding and providing input, and community members as well. So really the goal is how to bring more Indigenous voices and experiences into your classrooms. So some of the resources that are going to be available online, you can modify. So one example, I use the Métis Nation of Ontario website in some of my work before. For this project, I used the Métis Nation of Alberta and had students complete a task on that website. If you have a Métis Nation website for your province, then insert that and make adjustments. Always make sure that students are getting to know the local Indigenous peoples first in your area. And when I started teaching in 2010, it was really hard to find resources created by Indigenous people where today it's vast. There's so many different examples online, books, and so on. So we're in a huge state right now where we actually do have more access to information and more Indigenous peoples who've shared their stories that can be shared within classrooms. Whenever we're including Indigenous content or any type of subject that has to do with a lived identity, cultural safety has to be a priority, and that's something that I'm going to share more about tonight, but really encourage everyone to read the blog online. It has some history to cultural safety as well. And first things first, I always start with terminology, especially with students. There's multiple terms, and making sure that students have a common understanding of what terms to use, what to not to use, and when, and so on is really important. So one thing as well for especially terminology is making sure that you're using resources that were created by Indigenous peoples, especially some that might include Indigenous languages. I am not going to attempt to provide terminology to students in multiple Indigenous languages if I can't pronounce those words properly. So I'm going to find resources online from people from those nations to make sure the pronunciation is appropriate, and some explanation can go along with that as well. So some of you may have seen this video. I just wanted to use this as a starting point, but this is a video that is part of the terminology lesson plan that's included in this series. It's a great place to start with students, and there's a few activities that I'm going to show as examples that you can use to make sure you have an understanding of students' prior knowledge and current knowledge.
Indigenous, First Nations, Inuit, Métis, Aboriginal. There are so many different terms out there that it can be kind of confusing if you don't know what they all mean. But actually, it might be simpler than you think. I'm Ozzy Michelin, and I'm an Inuk journalist from Northwest River, Labrador, and I'm here to teach you how to talk about Indigenous people in Canada. Let's start with the term Indigenous. According to the United Nations, there are 370 million Indigenous people worldwide, spread across 70 countries. In Canada, there are approximately 1.4 million people who identify as Indigenous. Here, there are three distinct groups that make up the term Indigenous: First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. First Nations is the largest and most varied group of Indigenous people, and they can be found from coast to coast to coast. Sometimes I hear people using the term Indigenous and First Nations as if they were interchangeable, but they're not. Using Indigenous when you're referring to a specific group is kind of like saying Asian when you're referring to the Vietnamese or South Koreans. It works sometimes, but if you use it all the time, it just sounds wrong. The rule of thumb is to be as specific as possible. If somebody's Cree, it's okay to refer to them as being Cree, and if you don't know, ask them how they self-identify. Next are the Métis. The Métis are the descendants of First Nations and European settlers, and often refer to a distinct geographic group coming from the historic Northwest. You can find Métis all across Canada, but they all share a unique, distinct cultural heritage. The Inuit are the maritime circumpolar people of Canada, with a homeland stretching all the way from Siberia to Greenland. In Canada, there are 4 Inuit homelands, but they're not all just north of 60, with populations in both Quebec and Labrador. In the Inuit language, Inuktitut, the word Inuit means people. And you might have heard the term Inuk before. Inuk means person. So remember, it's one Inuk, many Inuit. And don't say Inuit people, because that's redundant. So that's it for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. But what about Aboriginal? Do we still even use that term? Well, generally, no. It's out there still, but it's being replaced by Indigenous, which is an internationally used term. So remember these simple rules if you want to get it right. Be as specific as possible. If you're referring to one person or one community, then name it. If there's more than one community or people, then use the broader terms like First Nations, Inuit, or Métis. If there are different groups together, then say Indigenous. And if you don't know, ask. Most people are happy to tell you about where they're from, and where their parents are from, and where their grandparents are from, and where their whole family is from. That's kind of how it works in the Indigenous world. Thanks, I hope that helps. Nakumek. Indigenous.
Okay, so that video's been around for a bit, and I always like to provide some additional details for students just to help understand a bit more about each term. So I have in the past as well used some different resources where I remind students which terms are kind of green light. You're pretty safe to use these terms at any time, but just recognizing that make no assumptions. Even students who are Indigenous, they don't necessarily might not be familiar with the term and what the term includes. Maybe they've just heard it here and there. Each person's going to have their own experience with terminology that they've grown up with and what they're used to. So making sure that all students are aware that Indigenous includes First Nations, Inuit, and Métis is really important, and the distinctness between each of those nations and within the nations. For the term Aboriginal, in the video, it just basically says not to use it. There's many different opinions about why that term is offensive. Some don't like the prefix ab and so on. But there are some people who feel strongly that the term still should be used to make sure people are remembering that it's part of the Canadian Constitution that affirms rights. So you might still come across people who are using that term or referring to it as part of the Constitution, or maybe they just grew up with that term and that's what they're comfortable with and that's what they're used to. And what I really liked about the video is that to have someone who is a Inuk to actually explain the difference between Inuit and Inuk is really important. To have people speak to their own identities, and having resources that do that are always something that you should be prioritizing in your classrooms. So within Canada, there's been many terms, and sometimes people just get so like, oh, what am I supposed to use, and so on. And the reality is a lot of the different terms have been terms that have been imposed on Indigenous peoples, whereas each nation historically has usually had their own name for themselves in their own language. So I think it's really important as well to help students understand the vastness of all the different nations that are here still today, and in past history have had various names or their own names that they're reclaiming and making sure that they're trying to have shared with their youth and shared more broadly. So one example from the Elementary Teacher Federation document that they've made about cultural appropriation versus appreciation, they shared about Anishinaabe and how it actually means the original people. So again, a lot of students identity is not necessarily certain depending on their background and their personal experiences. So just navigate that gently. Never assume that someone who is First Nation is going to know the name of their people and their language. It's something through various activities and interactions with students you're going to be able to get to know. But to me, this is really important in the work that we do to make sure students don't think First Nation is just all one group, that there's nations within those nations. Another example that helps students basically shows that you've done your research, you understand colonialism, you understand how it impacts Indigenous peoples, is avoiding terminology like our Indigenous peoples or Canada's Indigenous peoples, or any types of sense, like a sense of ownership that could be offensive to Indigenous people. Indigenous Canadians, not every Indigenous person would necessarily identify as Canadian and could feel offended if you referred to them as an Indigenous Canadian. So as an example, this image on the screen here, around Canada 150, you had a lot of Indigenous people speaking up about various things, but one in particular as well is their own nationhood and identity. So even though Canada turned 150 years, a lot of Indigenous nations have been here for thousands of years. So this is just an example of, when you're using terminology, avoiding terms that could be necessarily offensive to people. So anytime you're bringing Indigenous content to your classrooms, to me, it shouldn't be a unit. It should be something that we're all working towards including throughout an entire course, whether maybe there's a more concentrated time period on it, but also like a news article once a week or so on, right? But terminology should be done before any inclusion, but also reminding students about terminology when you bring it in. So in introductory lessons, students are going to learn that the term Indian is not appropriate, but that it is still part of legal documents in Canada. So if you were to use a lesson plan that included the Indian Act, I would start the lesson plan by reminding students the history of that word and why we no longer use that word, but still to this day in the lesson plan, it's going to be used in the context of learning more about the Indian Act. So overall, terminology is going to vary. It could vary based on where you live, the group of people you work with, and some people might have personal preferences when it comes to terminology. So if I was working with someone who identifies as Indian, I know for myself, I wouldn't feel comfortable calling them that. So I might say, hey, this is Bob Joseph, and he's from this First Nation. And then that way I'm still acknowledging that they are First Nation, but using a term that I feel is more appropriate. And so I have Bob's image here and his website, because a lot of the resources connected to the terminology lesson plan come directly from Bob's website. So definitely check it out. So in the series online, there's 5 different introductory lessons. So obviously terminology is going to be the first lesson. And then there's various ones to help gain some background knowledge about Indigenous people. And the next lesson I'm going to reference is an example from the lesson called Learning from Indigenous Peoples. So Amanda's going to post in the chat a link to a document, or you can scan the QR code on the screen with your phone, and it's going to send you to a Google Doc. And this place, 150 Years Retold, is used multiple times throughout this series of lessons. In this example in particular, we're just going to take a few minutes and individually, if you can, read through the foreword of this graphic novel, and it's created by Alicia Elliott. And then I'll show you how I've used it in the classroom. So you can go ahead and do that now. But like extra thumbs up, because I love reading that forward. It's so inspiring. So this slide, you don't need to complete this task, but usually in the classroom, when I do this activity, I'll read the forward aloud to students myself, and they can follow along. I usually just photocopy the handout onto one page, front and back. And I have the students then do this activity as they reread it on their own. It's a way to get to know a bit about each student. So when they're circling statements that are important to them, I can see kind of what they value. If there's any words they're not sure about, they will underline them. Often some need clarification on anthology or assimilation. So I have a slide that has some definitions as well. And then if there's something that they're curious about or have questions about, I have them put a question mark beside it. So it's a pretty good activity because it's pretty level entry for any student. Usually some will circle quite a bit, some will circle a few, but it's a way as an educator that I can walk around the classroom and address some questions they might have or some common questions as well. So what I would do from there, also within this lesson, I would have the students complete a personal reflection. So this is a way that as an educator, I can get to learn more about what previous learning experiences students have had, and kind of maybe if it's an Indigenous studies course, a senior elective, for example, then when they answer question 2, I kind of might find out a little bit more about what inspired them to take the course. One of the things that's really important to me about this personal reflection is the first question is kind of a safe way for students to share if they are Indigenous or not. And it's their option too. So, for example, if someone says, well, I've learned from my grandma and she's Indigenous and so on. And often some students, it's a safe way for them to kind of share maybe their connections. Some might admit, I only know a little bit, I am Indigenous, but I haven't had a chance to learn, right? So that's something that individually students may share, but if you kind of go throughout your course, if you don't do something like this, you might not have an idea. You can never assume who is Indigenous or who's not. And so to have a way for students to feel comfortable to share something that just you are going to read, it's a really great way that I like to start a lot of my classes. So at the bottom, it mentions it's one example of an activity to support cultural safety, right? So been mentioning cultural safety, and if you're in Ontario, a lot of the curriculum documents that have been updated since about 2018 all include this term, cultural safety, and its history, its roots come from New Zealand and working with Indigenous people in the hospital settings, but it has applications basically anywhere, and it's not only applicable to Indigenous peoples, it's applicable to everyone. So it's basically having a safe learning environment where ideas and opinions can be put out there, but aren't going to be offensive to people. So if we're having a class discussion, I probably am not going to enter into a class discussion with introductory topics unless it's a pretty safe question. So with the Indigenous terminology, the activity that I have includes students reviewing definitions and just sharing and reflecting on maybe what did they already know, what do they have questions about individually. A culturally unsafe practice would be for me on week 1 to enter into my classroom and say, hey, what terms have we heard about Indigenous peoples? Because that's just inviting trouble into the classroom and inviting maybe some stereotypes, some really inappropriate terminology to get in there. So that's an example of, within cultural safety, we're providing learning in an atmosphere that is going to be safe for everyone. So culture and cultural safety includes people's way of living, attitudes, behaviors, connections with others. So it has a lot to do with identity as well. So it's not just applicable to Indigenous people or Indigenous content. Cultural safety basically should be part of all classrooms, and with any topics, especially topics that could be challenging, traumatic, or sensitive. So basically each person's experience and cultural background is being respected, and they're going to be free from harm as best as possible. And how we as educators are applying different strategies and activities in the classroom, cultural safety is something that needs to be prioritized. So often the theory of cultural safety is usually put out there without kind of actionable examples. So when you go to read the cultural safety blog, this is just an example of some of the examples we provided. So there's a chart with what you should do and what you shouldn't do. And so then that way you kind of have an idea of concrete things that you can implement in your classroom. So it goes along with any identities, but also the example provided in a lot of curriculum documents deals with residential schools. So there's some examples of, before I even enter into learning on residential schools, there's work I'm going to do beforehand, information I'm going to gather from students, and then also input I'm going to gather as well. All right, I think I'm a bit better. Before I move on to the lessons, just want to acknowledge that Star McGackie Albert is the person who helped me with the blogs, and a lot are based on our experiences working with schools and educators and getting input from students. Star's from Chippewas of the Thames First Nations and First Nation, and she's an Indigenous education lead in the Thames Valley District School Board. As for the lessons, there's about 15 lessons that are part of this series. Carrie Day and Paul Wiper are two non-Indigenous educators who supported, either led the development of some of the lessons with my support, or we worked together on the lessons. So you'll see that the lessons have examples of Indigenous leaders, Indigenous events that are important in the lives of Indigenous peoples. And what's pretty exciting as well is there's literacy resources specific to, so for example, if you're preparing for the literacy test in Ontario, there's different articles from CBC Indigenous with questions to go along with them. And then embedded in a lot of these lesson plans as well are different literacy activities too. So overall, as you're interacting with the lessons, some of the questions people had prior to the webinar today were just about working with Indigenous content and the best way to bring it into classrooms. When we're working with teachers, we often tell them to present themselves as facilitators. We're not experts. Even myself, even though I am First Nation, I'm not going to be an expert in anything. I'm an expert in my own experience, and that's it. But overall, if I'm going to be teaching students about a different First Nation than my own or my own experience, I'm going to facilitate that learning by finding videos or finding resources from that community and presenting those to students and making sure they know where they're from. So I'm never going to generalize and say, oh, here's an example of, First Nation something. Be specific, and if you can, make sure they know where the First Nation is that you're talking about. And my slideshows, I'll often put like a little Google image map and make sure students have a reference of where's the nation that we're referring to. Humility and transparency is also really important. So making sure students know a bit about your own background, if you are Indigenous or non-Indigenous, being transparent. If there's something you're not sure about, don't try to force an answer, making sure that you'll say, I'm going to go find someone who can help us get to that answer. Knowing that there's not only one answer as well is really important. And you're going to notice as you look through the different lessons, that the focus is really on content, which means facts, populations, events connected to Indigenous peoples. Any inclusion of Indigenous cultures includes one, for example, there's a video by someone who's sharing Anishinaabe worldviews and her own personal experiences and examples. So cultural appropriation is if we try to place ourselves within the culture of someone else that's not our own, and trying to share examples of that culture, which is not the right thing to do. So anytime any type of cultural examples or Indigenous languages are involved, those should come from people from those nations. When you're looking through the lessons, if you're not sure about some of the background information, often there's links to resources to help you learn more about the background information connected to the lesson plans. One thing would be to not allow debates on Indigenous experiences and values. So one of the lessons in particular talks about land protection, and even includes the image of land protection versus protesters. So in the media, often people who are out as land protectors or water protectors, some media outlets kind of create this image that they're just in the way and they're it's kind of a negative imagery, whereas the truth and the reality is that a lot of these Indigenous nations and people that are standing up to protect the land are doing that to protect the land for everyone, not just Indigenous peoples, for future generations and so on. So in those lesson plans, it will explicitly state examples of cultural safety considerations to not turn into a debate. Should the pipeline go through? Should the pipeline not happen? And things like that. The goal of those lessons is to help people build their understanding as to why Indigenous peoples are protecting land. Another thing I felt important to share is to always provide multiple options for students, whether that's content or tasks. So the written example I shared earlier, if you have a student who really prefers just to speak and wants to share their answers with you one-on-one, provide those options for students, make them feel comfortable in your classrooms. And then in terms of content, when it comes to any like challenging, traumatic, or sensitive content, to never force that upon students. So for example, if you're teaching an English class and you're thinking of what resources to use, the work that I've done with educators is often we very much usually go against any class novels and always have literature circles where students can choose what books they're going to read and make sure that any type of content that should be brought to their attention before they select it is shared with them, so they know what they're choosing. If there's any type of assault, for example, in the book, students have the right to know that beforehand. And any type of traumatic or sensitive content that's in there, it doesn't just affect one group of students. It could impact everyone. Like multiple students. We don't know each student's experience. So, for example, thinking that a class novel on residential schools is a good idea. For some students, they're oversaturated with that trauma. They're living in that result of that trauma still to this day. So that might not be a resource that they want to put themselves through. And they have that right to have an option of other resources. So instead of outing them, having 3 to 4 books as options for students. So then that way they're picking something that is expanding their learning and understanding, but also that they're comfortable with engaging with. So before we get to questions, just basically reminders that as the website continues to build, the cultural safety blog is already up there, and it's pretty detailed. Take time to read through, look at the examples of what does that mean in your classroom. The terminology blog has expanded information and it'll direct you towards the lesson plan as well to help you further understanding if you had questions about some of the terminology today. Always review your lessons and prepare to implement them in your classes. So the lessons that are on the website, they don't necessarily have to go with just one certain classroom. Modify as you get to know your students and make them fit best for the group that's in front of you. And overall, just keep learning from Indigenous peoples. Like, huge thank you for being here this evening. Thank you to Defining Moments Canada for all this work and the opportunity to do this. But for myself, like, I follow a lot of people on social media and different things that'll come up. Experiences students have that we can learn from. One in particular, that's really impacted me is I once read about a student saying, they showed up to a university lecture and were not told beforehand that the lecture was about residential schools. And for her, she feels like she had a pretty good understanding, and she would like that heads up to know that, if she doesn't want to be there that day, she shouldn't have to be there, and or what other accommodations can be made, or what supports would she want to have in place. So in my lifetime, I've also taught online. And so if I had content about residential schools, I made sure students knew it was there. But I'd also say, if you're familiar with residential schools, then, please skip slides 10 to 20 and move on to the next information. So, just keep learning from different experiences. Obviously, we want to see more good experiences as examples, but continuous feedback from Indigenous students is something that really drives a lot of the work that I do. Very happy, like I mentioned before, there's more and more online resources that are out there. You're coming here tonight, there's presentations in person and online that, luckily, if this was helpful for you, share it with your colleagues, share it with people in your school. Some of my staff that I work with are here, so hello to people from Saunders. Some of the questions we had as well are just different examples of resistance that people could be including in their classroom within the last century. So I often refer to the Historica Canada timeline that I think is pretty great. Some had asked about resources for Orange Shirt Day. I've previously helped make some that is appropriate by different grade levels, and those are housed on the Thames Valley District School Board Indigenous Education website, so take a chance to browse around there. CBC Indigenous is something I use almost daily when I'm teaching to keep up with what's latest in the news, but also what other awesome resources can I share with students. They're even sometimes uploading videos from 30, 40 years ago that they're finding in the CBC archives that I'm using in my history classes. And then Beyond 94, basically, how is Canada doing in terms of truth and reconciliation in Canada is a website I often refer to and use in each of my classes as well. So overall, within Canada, calls to action 62 and 63 are what you're supporting tonight by being here. And some staff has also asked about, how do we do this work with all non-Indigenous students? And a lot of it is about building that understanding mutual respect, helping them learn more about Indigenous peoples, whether it's ongoing atrocities that are happening, and how can we change things? How do we listen to Indigenous peoples to move forward and make the next however many years better than the past? And many of you identified there's a huge need for teacher training, and that's something we got to keep pushing for as well. But luckily, free opportunities like this happen. And I know for me, I often tune into different podcasts or YouTube videos to gather up any information I can when I'm in a space to do so. So I'm gonna check the chat, but also if we have questions, if people want to put their hands up or if they want to put it in the chat, whatever everyone's comfortable with.